You know how sometimes you see a headline and it just sticks with you?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
We were digging through our sources on all this recent buzz around trade, and one title really jumped out. Tariffs. Tolls, Trump, and trade wars. The drama you didn't know you needed.
Uh, yeah, it's almost got a soap opera vibe, hasn't it?
Totally. And that's kind of what we're diving into today, tariffs.
Exactly. We're going to unpack what tariffs actually are, explore why countries use them, and really focus on some, well, significant shifts we've seen recently, particularly in the United States, under President Trump in 2025.
Right. Think of this as your cheat sheet, maybe.
Yeah.
Helping you understand a pretty important topic without having to wade through mountains of, super dense reports.
Precisely. We've gathered a fascinating range of stuff for you. Detailed analyses of U.S. tariff policies, some historical perspectives that might just flip what you thought you knew.
Oh, interesting.
Plus international trade reports for the global view, and of course the news that's been breaking it all down.
So our goal today is pretty simple, really. We want to give you a crystal clear picture of tariffs. We'll highlight the most interesting bits, maybe a few surprising facts along the way. Just make it all stick.
Sounds good.
Okay, so let's get started. What in the world is a tariff anyway? Fundamentally?
Well, in its simplest form, a tariff is basically a tax. It's a tax that a government slaps on goods coming in from other countries.
Okay, a tax on imports. Got it.
And it's the company importing the goods that pays this tax. Usually it's a percentage of the value of whatever they're bringing in.
Right. So, if you have a toy that costs $10 to import, and there's a 10% tariff.
Exactly. That importer now has to pay an extra dollar in tax.
Okay.
So that toy effectively costs them $11, even before they think about their own profit margin.
Makes sense.
And, while we mostly talk about taxes on imports, it's worth a quick mention. Some countries do occasionally tax goods going out, export taxes, but that's much, much less common.
Okay. So it's like a fee just for crossing the border with your stuff. Now, when we talk about these tariffs, are they all the same? Is it just always that percentage thing?
Not quite. There are actually a few different flavors, you could say. The ad valorem tariff is what we just talked about with the toy.
Yeah.
It's a percentage of the item's value.
The 10%.
But then you also have specific tariffs. These are different. They're a set fee for each unit, per item, no matter how much that unit is actually worth.
Oh, okay. Like what?
Think of it like maybe a $2 charge on every single bottle of imported olive oil, whether it's a cheap brand or something really fancy. It's $2 per bottle, period.
Ah, I see. Flat fee.
Exactly. And then, just to keep things extra complex, sometimes you get combo tariffs.
Seriously?
Yeah, they blend both. A specific fee plus a percentage of the value. It's like they're trying to cover all the bases,
A real pick and mix of taxes. Okay, all right. So we've got the what. Now, the big why. Why would a country actually put these taxes in place? What's the thinking behind it?
Well, there are a few key reasons governments do this. One of the main ones is protection.
Protection.
Yeah, protecting local industries from foreign companies that might be selling similar goods at lower prices. The idea is you make the imported goods more expensive with a tariff, and that gives your domestic producers a better chance, a leg up, in selling their own stuff.
Okay, makes sense. What else?
Governments also use tariffs just to bring in revenue, money for the government coffers. Historically, this was actually a really important income source, especially in the early days, for many countries.
Right, like basic funding.
Exactly. And lastly, tariffs are often used strategically as a tool in international trade and policy.
Oh, so?
Well, they can be used to encourage certain actions from other countries, or maybe to protect industries that a government thinks are crucial, like for national security or economic stability. Leverage, basically.
Okay, so protect local businesses, get some cash, maybe use it as a negotiation tactic. I've also heard the argument that tariffs protect jobs at home. Is that straightforward? Like tariffs and much more jobs?
That's where things get a bit more tangled. It's not quite that simple.
Okay.
In the short term, maybe. If you put a tariff on imported washing machines, let's say,
Right.
it might boost demand for the washing machines made right here. And that could potentially save or even create jobs in those specific factories. That can happen.
But coming, isn't there?
There's definitely a but. What often happens next is retaliation. The countries whose washing machines are now being taxed. Products, whatever.
It's like a trade fight.
Exactly. So while you might save some jobs in the washing machine industry, you could end up losing jobs in those other sectors, the ones that rely on exports.
Right, the ones getting hit by the new tariffs from the other side.
Precisely. One of our sources had a great analogy for it. They called it a food fight with a fork.
Huh. I like that.
You might score a point initially, but pretty soon everyone's just throwing stuff back and forth. It rarely translates to an overall gain in employment across the whole economy.
The spaghetti and meatballs of trade wars. Got it. Now, tariffs aren't exactly a new invention, are they? They've been around the block a few times.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They have a surprisingly long history.
Can we get a quick historical snapshot?
Sure. In the United States, for instance, the Tariff Act of 1789 was one of the very first laws passed by the new federal government.
Wow. Right at the beginning.
And its main goal back then, purely revenue, raising money for this brand new government.
Okay.
But what might raise an eyebrow for some people is that for a significant chunk of its history, the U.S. was actually quite protectionist, used tariffs a lot.
Really? That kind of goes against the later image of the U.S. pushing free trade, doesn't it?
It does. It often gets glossed over. Think about Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary.
Right.
He was a big believer in using tariffs and other measures to protect what he called infant industries.
Infant industries.
Yeah, new American businesses that, needed some shelter from more established foreign competition so they could grow and thrive. Use tariffs to give them breathing room.
So the U.S. wasn't always waving the free trade flag then. That is a fun fact.
Indeed. And it's not just a U.S. story either. Historically, Britain also used protectionist policies really heavily to build up its own manufacturing sector.
Ah, okay. How did they do that?
Well, they even put restrictions on their own colonies to stop them from developing industries that might compete with British ones.
Wow.
For instance, they actually banned imports of cotton textiles from India at one point, which were superior quality back then, all to protect Britain's own emerging textile industry.
That's pretty ruthless.
It's a good reminder, though. Many countries that later became champions of free trade often used protectionism themselves to get a strong economic footing first.
Good point.
And we also saw a big shift away from free trade globally during the Great Depression, as countries desperately tried to shield their own struggling economies. Everyone threw up barriers.
Okay, so a pretty interesting and sometimes unexpected history there. Now let's fast forward to more recent times. We're focusing on the second Trump administration in 2025. Sounds like tariffs were a pretty hot topic then.
Oh, they certainly were. Very much front and center.
What exactly happened?
Well, in April 2025, President Trump announced some really sweeping tariff increases. Big ones.
Like what?
Including a flat 10% tariff on essentially all imported goods coming into the U.S.
Wait, 10% on everything?
Pretty much everything, yeah. It was a huge move. And projections showed this would push the average U.S. tariff rate up to around 24%.
24% average? That sounds high.
It would be the highest it's been in over a century, even higher than during the Smoot-Hawley tariff era in the 1930s.
Wow. The one people blame for making the Depression worse.
That's the one. So, yeah, a really significant increase.
Okay, that 10% baseline sounds like a massive shakeup. What else was going on?
The administration also introduced this idea of reciprocal tariffs.
Reciprocal? Meaning what exactly? Tit for tat?
Sort of. The basic idea pitched was to match the tariffs that other countries imposed on U.S. goods. If they tax our stuff at X%, we tax theirs at X%. Sounds simple, right?
Okay, yeah. Seems fair on the surface.
Well, the way they actually calculated these reciprocal tariffs that raised a lot of eyebrows.
How did they calculate it?
They essentially took the U.S. trade deficit in goods with a particular country, divided it by the total value of U.S. imports from that country, and then cut that number in half.
Okay. That sounds specific. And maybe a bit arbitrary.
That's what many economists said. They strongly criticized the formula, called it overly simplistic, based on a misunderstanding of economic principles.
Ouch.
Some even joke it was about as logical as, taxing imports based on the color of the packaging. So, yeah, not widely accepted as sound economics.
Doesn't sound like it. And how were these tariffs actually put into place? Did they have to go through Congress, long debates?
This is where it got a bit unusual, legally speaking. The administration frequently relied on things like the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
IEPA. What's that?
It basically allows the president to regulate commerce during a declared national emergency. They declared multiple national emergencies related to things like border security or trade imbalances.
Ah. Okay.
And argued this gave them the authority to impose tariffs quickly, bypassing some of the usual, more involved processes required by trade laws.
So using emergency powers for trade policy.
Exactly. Now, IEPA had been used for sanctions before, against specific countries or groups, but using it so broadly for general tariffs like this was pretty unprecedented. It sparked significant legal challenges and debates about the limits of presidential power in this area.
I can imagine. So what were some of the specific goods that got hit with these new or increased tariffs, besides that general 10%?
Well, we saw the continuation and even expansion of tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Right. Those have been around for a bit.
Yeah, and they even extended the aluminum tariffs to cover things like canned beer and empty aluminum cans.
Ah, beer cans.
Yep. Then there were significant 25% tariffs slapped on automobiles and auto parts.
Oof, that must have hit hard.
Although there were some exceptions made for parts that complied with the USMCA trade agreement, the one with Canada and Mexico.
Okay.
And of course, that broad 10% tariff on almost everything else. But notably, tariffs on goods coming from China were exceptionally high.
How high?
Reports indicated they reached a total of 145% in some cases.
145%.
Yeah, when you combine the base tariff with what they called a fentanyl tariff and that reciprocal component we talked about.
That's a lot.
It is. Interestingly, though, the full reciprocal tariffs on countries other than China were reportedly put on hold or delayed.
Okay. Any other areas?
There were also investigations launched into digital sales taxes that other countries were imposing, suggesting potential future tariffs in the digital realm as well.
Okay, so some pretty big targeted increases, especially hitting China hard. How did the rest of the world react to all this? I mean, I can't imagine they just sat back and said, okay, fine.
No, you're right. There were some pretty strong international reactions and, crucially, retaliation.
Like who?
Canada, for instance. They slapped tariffs on billions of dollars worth of U.S. goods, things like steel, aluminum, vehicles, other stuff too. Mexico also retaliated with tariffs of their own.
Okay, neighbors hitting back.
And China's response was particularly robust. Not just tariffs on a wide array of U.S. goods, but other actions too.
Such as?
Things like halting imports of U.S. lumber and restricting exports of certain critical minerals that U.S. industries rely on.
So using different kinds of economic pressure.
Exactly. The European Union also announced plans for retaliatory tariffs, but reports suggested they held off on actually implementing them, at least initially.
And what about the bigger picture, the global economy? Did these tariffs have much impact there? Did they, achieve what they were supposed to?
Well, the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, they actually lowered their global economic growth forecast for 2025.
Oh.
And they specifically cited these new U.S. tariffs as a major contributing factor. They also projected the U.S. economy itself would take a significant hit.
So not great news from the IMF.
No. And there were even reports coming out of the U.S. suggesting the economy might have actually shrunk in the early months of 2025.
Really?
Alongside that, we saw some pretty significant drops in stock market indices right after the tariff announcements.
Yeah, markets don't usually like uncertainty, do they?
Definitely not.
Yeah.
It reflected investor worries about the potential negative effects on company profits, global trade flows, supply chains, the works. In just a couple of days in April 2025, U.S. stocks reportedly lost something like a staggering $6.6 trillion in value.
$6.6 trillion. That's a number that just makes your eyes water.
It really is. Shows the scale of the reaction.
So, given all that, were there any arguments being made in favor of these tariffs, or was it all just bad news from an economic standpoint?
No, there are certainly arguments that proponents make. They often highlight the need to protect domestic industries from what they see as unfair competition, often called dumping.
Dumping. What forms does that take?
It can be various things, like countries intentionally devaluing their currency to make their exports artificially cheap, or offering unfair tax advantages to their own industries,
Okay.
or maybe having lower labor standards or weaker environmental regulations, which lowers their production costs in ways seen as unfair. So tariffs are presented as a way to level the playing field against that.
Right. What else?
The classic argument about supporting infant industries comes up again, giving new domestic businesses a chance to grow.
Like Hamilton back in the day.
Exactly. And sometimes there's also an argument made for helping older, maybe struggling industries adapt to, the changing global landscape, giving them some breathing room too.
Okay. But what about the downsides? It sounds like most economists tend to view tariffs pretty negatively overall.
That's generally true. There's a pretty strong consensus among economists that tariffs, on the whole, tend to have negative effects on economic well-being.
Why is that?
Well, they typically lead to higher prices, both for consumers, who end up paying more for imported goods or domestic goods that now face less competition,
Right.
and also for producers, manufacturers, who often rely on imported materials or components. Their costs go up, which can hurt their competitiveness or get passed on as higher prices too. Plus, disruptions to complex global supply chains.
Okay, so higher prices, messed up supply chains.
And then there's the big risk we already talked about, retaliatory tariffs.
The food fight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Leading to this lose-lose situation where multiple economies get hurt. As the famous economist Milton Friedman once quipped,
Yeah.
he said, "We call a tariff a protective measure." It does protect. It protects the consumer against low prices.
Huh. That's a good one. A bit sarcastic, but makes the point.
It does.
Good.
Furthermore, many economists point out that tariffs don't really fix the fundamental reasons behind trade deficits anyway.
Oh, why not?
Because trade deficits are more related to a country's overall patterns of consumption and savings. If a country consumes more than it produces, it will generally import more. Tariffs don't really change that basic equation.
So the idea that just slapping on tariffs will automatically balance the trade books is a bit of a misconception then.
Pretty much, yeah. In fact, sometimes a growing trade deficit can actually be a sign of a strong domestic economy with high consumer demand, at least in some respects.
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Okay. We've talked a lot about the U.S. situation. What about how other countries are using tariffs in the world today? Is everyone sort of jumping on this protectionist bandwagon, or is it mixed?
It's definitely a pretty diverse picture globally. You see different approaches.
For example?
Well, Russia, for instance, implemented a significant number of protectionist measures back in 2013, actually making it quite a leader in that area at the time.
Interesting.
India has been using tariffs more actively as part of its Make India initiative, trying to encourage more domestic manufacturing.
Okay, using it proactively.
Right. But then, on the flip side, you have Switzerland. They recently made news by completely eliminating all tariffs on industrial goods coming into the country.
Wow, the opposite direction.
Exactly. And the expectation there is that it will actually provide a significant boost to their economy by lowering costs for businesses and consumers.
Fascinating.
And then you have cases like Armenia. After joining the Eurasian Economic Union, they actually had to increase tariffs on goods coming from outside that economic bloc to align with the union's common external tariff. So it really varies. There's no single global trend right now.
It's fascinating to see such different strategies playing out simultaneously. Now, beyond just the pure economics, it feels like tariffs can also be a pretty powerful tool in the political arena, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
Politics is often deeply intertwined with tariffs.
How so historically?
Well, historically, they've definitely been used to achieve political goals. Like that U.S. Tariff Act of 1789 we mentioned, it wasn't just about revenue. It was seen as essential for establishing the economic independence of the new nation. A political statement.
Right, asserting sovereignty.
Exactly. And tariffs can easily become major talking points, even deciding factors in elections. We've seen that happen in places like Australia, for example.
Yeah, I can see how that would fire people up.
But it cuts both ways. Unpopular tariffs can also spark significant social unrest.
Like riots.
Yeah. A stark example comes from Chile, where tariffs imposed on imported cattle led to what were called the meat riots because prices shot up. It really underscores how these seemingly dry economic policies can have very real-world political and even social consequences.
Definitely. Well, this has been a truly insightful deep dive into the world of tariffs.
Right.
We've covered a lot of ground from their historical roots to some pretty significant and very recent developments.
A big topic.
It really is. So to maybe wrap things up, what are the key takeaways that we should keep in mind from all this?
I think the main points to remember are that tariffs are complex tools. They have a long and really varied history. They're used for a multitude of reasons, protecting domestic industries, yes, but also generating revenue, and importantly, serving as leverage in international trade negotiations. They're not just one thing.
Right. Multifaceted.
And the recent widespread tariff changes introduced in the U.S. in 2025 represent a really significant shift in trade policy, one that triggered substantial international responses and raised some big questions about the future of global economic growth and the balance of power in international trade.
Okay. So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to really chew on after all this. Considering those immediate jitters we saw in the markets and the ongoing debate among economists about the longer-term consequences, what do you think will be the lasting impact of these widespread tariffs? On global trade, sure, but also on our everyday lives. Are they, in the end, a necessary shield for domestic economies? Or are they more of a risky gamble with potentially damaging repercussions down the line?
Definitely something to think about.
It is. Thanks, everyone, for taking this deep dive with us today.